In this video, we will learn about a important and powerful concept in React called hooks. So hooks was a concept which got introduced recently in React. It came in React 16.8 and it's widely used and it's a very powerful concept. So let's start learning it. So we have learned earlier that there are two basic kinds of components in React: class components and function components. The basic difference between class components and function components is that function components do not have state and do not have access to React lifecycle methods. So these two things are not available or present in function components, which is why they were referred to as dumb or stateless components. What did React Hooks do? React Hooks, as we discussed, which was a new addition in React 16.8, is a special function that lets you hook into React features. They let you use state and other React features like lifecycle without writing a class. So basically, React Hooks is a way to enhance the power and capabilities of function components so that we can start doing stuff similar to what we could do in a class component. So that's the purpose of hooks, and as you start using it, you will realize there are a certain set of advantages they give us over class components. But for the purpose of this video, we will just learn how to use React Hooks. So the first aspect of React Hooks that we will learn is useState. useState is a hook to add React state to function components. So as we have discussed earlier, function components did not have state. So useState is the hook we use to add React state to function components. Previously, to access state within a function component was not possible. So if we had to access state, we could create only class components. useState hook allows access to state inside the existing function component. So that is the purpose, that is the advantage or power that useState gives us. So let's look at an example and see how useState is used, and then we will discuss more about useState. Create a component named counter defined as a class component, which displays the value of count with buttons to increment and decrement its value. So basically, we will have the count saved in the state and we will keep on incrementing and decrementing that value. Note, counter has been defined as a class component. What we want to do is now implement the same component as a function component using the hook useState. So we need count as the state of that component. So we will use state to define it as a function component. So let's do it. So here in our main component, we just use this counter and we just display this counter. And we have defined counter as a state component, as a class component. So it has a state count which is initialized to 0. And in that we just show two buttons, increment and decrement, which use this function setCount function to update the state value. So very typical usage of a class component. And if we run it, we just get this kind of an output, and you can increment and decrement these values of the count. Now what do we want to do? We want to implement the same thing as a function component with the useState hook. So let's start doing that. So in counter hooks, let us implement the same functionality but as a function component with the hooks useState. So let's start doing it. So import So here we import React and the useState. Let's call this function, say this component counter hooks. Now let's first implement the display. So I will just copy the display component. So what all do we need? We need the on click to be defined. So let's, for a minute, let me delete the on click. So we have now, and we need to display the count. We don't have a state. So now how do we create a state here? So we will use, say, const count comma set count is equal to use state 0. So we are using state here, and we are defining these two things, count and set count. Count is the name of that field in the state, and set count is the way we will use to update the count. So these are the two things we defined. So always when we use state, when we do use state, we will provide these two things to it. And here 0 means the initial value that will be given to the count. So this is the first time. So the first time this component is created, count will get the value 0. So now how can we access it? This can be accessed in the standard way. You clicked count times. Now we need to define here the on click. So let's define the on click. And what would we say in the on click? We will need to modify it. So we will use the set count. So this is decrement. So this will become count minus 1. So set count will update the value of the count, and it will cause all the re-rendering and everything to happen. Similarly, here we can say on click is equal to, and we will use set count to update the value of count, and here it will be count plus 1. Instead of counter class demo, let's call it counter hooks demo, so that difference is there. And in our main component, let us say import counter hooks from counter hooks, and the component here is counter hooks. Let's run this code. Counter hooks does not contain a default export, so that's the error. Let's add that. We forgot. Export default counter hooks. Let's test it again. So counter hooks demo. So we are in the counter hooks function component. You clicked 0 time. We are incrementing. We are decrementing. Let's do one more change here. Let's say the initial value is, say, 15. So the first time when we displayed, we should get 15. That's the value of count. And this is the value we can see from here. We are incrementing and decrementing. So this is how we have used our useState to create this variable or this count that we can use here. And while creating count, we have also created this set count, which is the name of the function which we are using to update the count. So we have the field and the way to update the field. Next, what it is saying, define a function add to counter to increment and decrement the value of the counter. So what does that mean? What that means is, instead of using this here, let's define a function. So we will get to know how to define a function also. So we can say function add to counter, and it takes the number to add. And how do we do it? We will just say we'll call set count here with count plus num. And here we can just call it, instead of set count, it is add to counter -1, and this will be add to counter 1. So exactly the same way we are doing it. Let's go ahead and test it. So I can increment it, I can decrement it. Let's, so that we are clear, let's just make it say 5 into num. So now you can see this is how it's being run. So why did we do this? So this also helps us understand how do we define functions within a function component and use them. So for our event handlers or for supporting things, we can define such functions and use them. And these things that we have defined with useState, so the count and set count is available to this function also, as we have used here. So let's understand what we have done here with useState. Let's recap it. So we defined here const count comma set count is equal to useState 0. So what does that mean? It means that we declared a state variable called count. That's what we did. Set its initial value to 0, and this happened only for the first time. And set count is used to update the value of count. So these are the three things that happen when we define it like this, and then we can use count and set count within the code in whichever fashion or manner we want to use. Let's look at another exercise. Create a component named counterAB defined as a class which displays the value of count A and count B with buttons to click and increment their values. So in this case, what it means that in our state, we will have two fields, count A and count B, and with buttons to increment them. Implement the same component as a function component using the hook useState. So here we will need to use multiple fields in our state. So let us see how do we do that. So here in our main component, we are just displaying this counter AB. And what is counter AB? It has in its state a count A and a count B. And then we are just rendering the values of count A and count B with buttons click A and click B. So very standard code, and we are doing this as a class component. So if we run it, counter AB class demo, you have clicked A 0 times and B 0 times. If I click on A, that value gets changed, the B, that value gets changed. Now what is our objective? Our objective is to implement the same thing as a function component with useState hook. So let's start doing that. Let's define our function, let's call it counter AB hooks. There are no props here, and now what do we want to render? Let me just copy the render from here. So we will return it. So what all do we need? We need the value of count A, we need the value of count B, we need this function, so we don't need this. So let's say we will create, we need to update this part of it also. So let us first create our useState. So we can say const count A comma set, let's call it set count A is equal to use state 0. Similarly, we can create another which is say count b comma set count b is equal to use state 0. So now we have created count a, count b, so we can use them directly here, and here it will be set count a, count a plus 1, and this will become set count b, count b plus 1. So this is the same code which will now work using hooks. Let's change this to counter AB hooks demo. Let's write our export default counter AB hooks, and then let's go to the main component and do that. Now let's go ahead and test it. So we get the counter AB hooks demo, and we are getting the desired output as we wanted. We could have changed the initial values. Let's just change it to something, say 10 and say 20. So A will be 10, B will be 20, which is what we are seeing here, and we are changing from there. Next, what do we want to do? Define function increment AB and use it to increment the values. So we want to define a function within the component, within the function component, and use that to increment the values. So let's define a function increment AB. Now what do we need to get? We need to get the, say, name. And what can we do? Or we can just say name is equal to A. Then what do we need to do? We need to just call set count A plus 1, else set count B plus 1. And here, instead of using set count A, we will use increment AB, and in the first case pass it A, and here increment AB and pass it the parameter, say B. The same thing should work here, and let's give it, say, the value 0 0, and let's test it. So the same thing is working. Let's test it with a slight change. So they increase by 2 and 3. So A is now increasing by 2 and B is increasing by 3. So the same thing we have done. We created a function. In the function, we could access count A, set count A, count B, set count B, and we used it exactly the way we typically use it in a normal component. So far we have studied the React hook useState, and useState is used to provide access to state to a function component. The next hook we will study is useEffect. UseEffect hook can be thought of as componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, and componentWillUnmount combined. So the component lifecycle events can be used using useEffect. Previously, a function could not access the component lifecycle events. A function component had no access to it. UseEffect gives us the ability to do that. So let's look at an example, and through that example see how do we use this hook useEffect. Create a component named showNums, defined as a class which displays the value of a number and its square stored in the state. The values are updated in the component lifecycle functions. implement the same component as a function component using the hooks useState and useEffect. So that is our objective. Let's see how to do that. So let us first run this code and then come back and study it. So here we are showing these num is equal to 2, num is equal to 3, 5, 7 and so on. And if we click on any one of them, it shows this class code, number is 3, square is 9. And you can see the route is /show numbers /3. If I click on 7, it becomes /show nums /7, and the class code and then number is 7 and the square is 49. This is what we are displaying. How are we doing it? In the main component, we have just this array of numbers, and within map, we are showing all the links, and we have just created a standard route with a route parameter. So what are we doing in show nums? We have in the state two fields, num and square, and in the component didMount and the component didUpdate, we are calling this update data. And what does update data do? It just sets the state for the number it received as a prop and the square. And then in the render, all we do is we display these values from the state. So note here, we could have done it from params. We did not need to save it in the state. The reason we are doing it with the state is to handle how to use useEffect, the hook useEffect. And the reason for that is that we need to handle it in the component lifecycle events, which is component didMount and component didUpdate. So the first time we will get the component didMount, and the next time, anytime a click happens on that component, on that link, we get the component didUpdate. So our objective is to now implement the same thing using a hook. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's start defining our code here. So here we need to import useState and useEffect. Let's define our function show nums hooks. There is no props that we need. Or do we need props? Yes, in this case we will need props. So let's get the props in. Now what do we need to do? So we have two state variables here, fields in the state. So let's create them. So const num comma set num is equal to use state 0. The other one is const square comma set square is equal to use state 0. So this is what we have done, and then in our return we will just display them. So let's just copy the return the piece here. This is exactly what we want. So this is exactly what we want. Now what is missing here? What is missing here is how do we use the component lifecycle. So like we updated the state in the component didMount and the component didUpdate by calling this function update data, we will need to do the same thing here so that these values are correct. So how should we do that? So for that we will use, say, useEffect, and in useEffect we will define a function, and let's say for a minute let's just do a console.log updating numbers for, which is the value. Let's first get the value from the props. So let n1 is equal to props dot match dot params dot, what was it, So we have gotten the value and let's display it here. So in useEffect as we know is the combination of componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate and componentWillUnmount. So for the componentDidMount and the componentDidUpdate, this function that we are defining here will get fired every time. So what do we need to do then? So we have gotten the numbers. We can just set the set num we can use to set the num to n1, and we can use set square to set square to num n1 into n1. So we can do that and this should work. Let's go ahead and test it. So let's export default show num hooks, and in our main component, and let's call it, say instead of class code we will call it hooks code, and in our main component we will use show num hooks. So let's go ahead and test it now. So if I click on num is equal to 5, we get this hooks code. Num is 5, square is 25. Similarly, when we click on them, these values are getting updated. Let's also look at the console. So we are getting all those values, but we are getting them twice. So why is that happening? So here in our show num hooks, we are getting them twice because we are updating the values also. So with the set, we are updating the values, which is calling them twice. So now how do we handle that? So the way to handle that is by passing a parameter to this function. And how do we pass it? So we pass it an array of values which need to change for this to get fired. So if n1 has changed, if this props has changed, then only this value will get fired. Let's test it now. So if I click on num is equal to 3, now you can see we are just getting it once and this is working fine. So all those values that we want it to be handled, we can provide that. If I give an empty array here, what will happen? Let's see that. Now you can see the value is not getting fired. So the first time it happened and after that it is not happening. So because there is no change, so we're not looking for any change. So how do we do that? We will just provide the value that we got in the props here and this should work fine. So this is a very important aspect of useEffect. So in the useEffect, we are defining this function. So this is the function that we have defined. And these are the parameters we have defined based on whose change we want this function to get fired. So if we want to understand useEffect, so this is the code we have written there. So it defines a function that is invoked after render on each lifecycle event. So each lifecycle event means here componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, and componentWillUnmount. We're not studying componentWillUnmount here. We're just looking at componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate. So this function is getting fired on each render, on each lifecycle event after each render. And the array passed to useEffect skip if values haven't changed between re-renders. So we will skip calling this function if these values have not changed between those re-renders. So it will check the previous value of n1 to the current value of n1. So in some sense, this is exactly like the comparison we used to do for props. if previous props not equal to this dot props. That is how we used to do in component did update. So in effect, we are implementing the same thing here using this array. Next, what do we want to do? Create a component named display defined as a class which fetches the details from the server and displays it. The REST API is get/displayinfo/:id. So here we are fetching details from the server and displaying it, and typically we know we need to use component lifecycle events to do that, because we will get the values from the server asynchronously and then we can display them. So here we will see how that use case is being solved. So implement the same component as a function component using the hook, useState and useEffect. So let us first run this app, this component display, see the output, and then go to the code and understand and make the requisite changes. So we are showing this link info1, which goes to /display/1, and if we click on it, we fetch those details from the server. So if we look at it, we are fetching those details from the server. So that is what is happening here, and we will do that within our component lifecycle events. So what are we doing in our main component? In our main component, we just displaying this link /display/1, and we have defined the route /display/:id maps to this component display. So here in our display, what are we doing? So in the state, we are storing the information, and then in our component didMount and component didUpdate, we are calling this update data. Note, in the component didUpdate, we are comparing previous props and this props before calling it. What does update data do? Update data just uses the HTTP service, uses http.get, fetches the data, sets it in the state. And what's the render doing? The render is just displaying the information from the state and displaying a next link. The service is a standard service. We just need a get, so we have defined a get. Now what do we want to do? We want to implement the same thing using hooks in a function component. So here we have our function component display hooks, which is like an empty component right now. So what do we need to do? We need to first define the state. So let's say const info comma set info is equal to use state, and let's say the initial value is null. That's the first thing we want to do. Next, what do we want to do? We need to fetch the data from the server. So let's get the ID for which we want to get it. ID is equal to props.match.params.id. I think so, it was called ID. Yes. So we have gotten the props, the ID. Then let's use our useEffect. Let's define our function that has to be called on the lifecycle events. Let's do, say, a console.log fetching data for this ID. Now, how do we fetch the data here? Exactly the same way that we did there. Let us get let response is equal to, or let's copy that code from our display. So we have gotten our response the same way, and here we will need to decorate this function as an async function. And now, instead of using this dot set state that we used in display, what we will do here is set info, and we will pass this data. So this is our effect. Now, when do we want to call it? Whenever the value of ID changes. So that's the parameter we have passed here. So now we need to display it. So we will just copy that render part here. And let's paste it. And this should work properly. So let's go to our main component. So let's call it, say, hooks code here. So in our main component, let us use display hooks from let's do that, and let's go ahead and test it. Display is not defined, display hooks. What is the error? This should have been export display hooks. Cannot read property state of undefined. So what's the error? Again, I guess a copy. So instead of this dot state dot info, this should have just been info. So now if we test it, let's clear all this stuff. We are getting the data from the server, hooks code. If I click on next, we get the data. If we go back to info1, we get it. And notice we are getting it only once. So we are getting fetching data for 1, and then the data that we get fetching data for 2, and so on. If we removed this parameter that we passed, what would we get? Let's test it. So now you can see we are getting it twice. If we made that change, that prevented that from happening again, and it was only this function was getting fired when the value of id changed. So this is a very common use case. And now what has happened here? So one of the advantages of using hooks is that instead of defining both these componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate, our code has become a single logic. So in the useEffect, we have combined them into a single logic that in display we had effectively done with these two conditions. So in a sense, you can see that these three functions have been written in a slightly different way using the hooks. There are some rules for using hooks which are very important, and we should always take care of them. So what are these rules? First rule is only call hooks at the top level. So do not call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. So what does this mean? What does call hook means? Calling that use state or that use effect. So that should only be done at the top level. So if we go back to our code here, we are calling this at the top level. So this is happening at the top level. It is not happening within a condition or that kind of a thing. The same thing is happening with useEffect. useEffect is being called at the top level. So that's the first rule. The second is only call hooks from React functions. Do not call them in JavaScript functions or event handlers. So like we saw in function components, you can define your event handlers and functions and use that, which are JavaScript functions. Don't do that. Call them only in your React functions that we have defined here. So the React functions here would mean, so in this main function we are calling it, so you can call them here. So call them in your React functions, but do not call them in the JavaScript function. So the first rule that we saw, so if we wanted something to happen on, say, we have a condition, if n1%2 is equal to 0, then set the number n1, the useEffect. No, this is wrong, incorrect usage, as hook is being called inside a condition. So this is a wrong usage. The correct usage would be useEffect, and within that put the condition to do a set now. So remember these rules, and with a bit of practice and writing code, hooks would become very clear to you.